It is the night of June 18th, 1815. Somewhere in the darkness south of Brussels, on a churned field of Belgian mud that the world will remember by a single word, Waterloo, the largest army Napoleon Bonaparte will ever again command lies broken. Tens of thousands of men are dead or dying in the wheat. The emperor who terrorized a continent for 2 decades is fleeing in a carriage toward Paris, toward exile, toward the end. And in London, more than 200 miles and one treacherous stretch of water away, nobody knows. Nobody in the coffee houses knows. Nobody on the floor of the stock exchange knows. The British government itself does not know. The official news of the greatest military victory in a generation is still crawling across the roads of Flanders, still waiting on the wind and the tide of the English Channel. The dispatch that will confirm it, carried by a young officer named Major Henry Percy, 2 captured French eagles strapped across his chest, still wearing the same blood-stained dress uniform he had danced in at the Duchess of Richmond's ball days. Before will not reach the capital until the night of June the 21st. Percy would land at Broadstairs, rattle up to London by post-chaise, and burst in on the Prince Regent at a party in St. James's Square, 3 full days after the guns fell silent. That is how fast official news traveled in the world before the telegraph, and that gap, those 3 days, is the empty space at the very center of our story. But there is a story. You have heard some version of it. It is one of the most repeated stories in the history of money. The story says that one man in London knew first. That a banker, small, sharp-eyed, foreign-born, standing against his usual pillar on the floor of the exchange, received private word of Wellington's victory a full day before anyone else. And that he used that knowledge to execute the single most audacious financial coup ever attempted. The story says he pretended to sell. That he dumped British government bonds in a theatrical panic. That the whole market watched him and assumed the worst, that Britain had lost, that Napoleon had won, and dumped their own holdings in a stampede. Prices collapsed. And then in the chaos he had engineered, his agents quietly bought up the entire market at rock-bottom prices. When the true news finally arrived, the value of those bonds exploded. And in a single day, the legend says, Nathan Mayer Rothschild made a fortune so vast he could have bought the Bank of England itself. It is a magnificent story. It has been told in books, in newspapers, in a Hollywood film, and even in the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It is the founding myth of the most famous banking dynasty in history. It is dramatic, it is cinematic, and it is repeated as fact to this day. And it is almost entirely a lie. Nathan Rothschild was not at Waterloo. He never watched Napoleon fall. He did not race across the channel with the news. There was no faked sell-off. There was no engineered crash. The market was not tricked. And yet, and this is the part that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, the truth is not that the Rothschilds made no fortune from the age of Napoleon. They made one of the largest private fortunes in the history of the world. The truth is that the real story is bigger, colder, and far more consequential than the myth. It is a story of smuggled gold, of sovereign debt, of nerve held past the point of endurance. So here's the question this video exists to answer. If the crash and grab never happened, then how did one banking family turn the fall of an emperor into the foundation of 2 centuries of power? Because the version in the textbooks leaves out the most important chapter, here's the full story. Let me tell you what actually powered the Rothschild fortune, because it is not what the legend sold you. The engine was not a trick played for a single afternoon on a trading floor. The engine was money itself, the slow, grinding, unglamorous machinery of financing a world war. Somebody had to pay for the armies that stopped Napoleon. Somebody had to move actual gold across a continent controlled by the enemy, coin by coin, box by box, at enormous personal risk. And somebody had to make an enormous, terrifying bet on what the peace would look like when the fighting finally stopped. The Rothschilds did all 3. That is where the money came from. And here is why you were never told this properly, because a boring truth about government contracts and bond yields makes a terrible story, while a lurid tale of a banker crashing a market with a single lie makes an unforgettable one. The myth was easier to sell. Worse, as we will see, the myth was deliberately weaponized. The real history was buried underneath it. Let us dig it back out. To understand the fortune, you first have to understand the problem it solved. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because it begins not with a battle, but with a logistics nightmare that nearly broke the British war effort. By August of 1812, the Duke of Wellington was fighting Napoleon's marshals across Spain and Portugal, the long grinding campaign we now call the Peninsular War, and he was running out of the one thing an army cannot fight without. Not men. Not muskets. Money, specifically hard money. Wellington needed roughly £100,000 every single month in specie, that is, in actual gold and silver coin. Because in Spain, in the middle of a war, nobody would take a British paper banknote. Since 1797, the Bank of England had suspended cash payments, so its notes could not even be reliably converted to gold at home, let alone trusted by a stranger abroad. If you wanted a Spanish farmer to sell you grain, or a muleteer to carry your supplies, or a Portuguese boatman to ferry your wounded, or a mercenary to keep fighting, you paid him in metal he could bite. Wellington complained bitterly and constantly to London about it. His letters from the front read like the ledgers of a desperate man. And Britain, an island, could not simply march that gold across a Europe that Napoleon controlled. The French blockade sat between Wellington's army and the coin it desperately needed. This is the problem that walked into the offices of a man named John Charles Harries, the British Commissary-in-Chief, the treasury official responsible for feeding, paying, and supplying the army. Harries had a nearly impossible remit and very few tools to meet it, and in January of 1814, Harries turned to a foreign-born banker in the city of London who had a reputation for making impossible money movements happen. His name was Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Nathan was one of 5 brothers, the sons of Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a coin and antique metal dealer from the cramped, gated Judengasse, the Jewish street of Frankfurt. The father had done something visionary. He had planted his sons across the great financial capitals of Europe like pieces on a chessboard. Amschel in Frankfurt, Solomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, James in Paris, and Nathan, the most aggressive and abrasive of them, in London. Nathan had arrived in England around 1799 as a young textile trader in Manchester, barely speaking the language, buying cheap cotton goods to ship back to the continent, and from that unglamorous start he clawed his way south into the money markets of the city. He ran the London house from an address that still means something in the square mile today, New Court on St. Swithin's Lane, where the bank sits to this hour. And that scattered family, spread across 5 cities and multiple warring nations, bound together by a private code and a shared Frankfurt dialect no outsider could read, was about to become the most powerful private intelligence in logistics. Network on the continent. Harries engaged Nathan to do something that sounds simple and was, in practice, staggeringly difficult. Procure gold coin, deliver it to Wellington's army in the field, bypass the French blockade. Do not let the enemy find out. And here is the critical detail that changes everything about how you should picture this operation. Nathan did not simply buy a mountain of gold in London and ship it. That would have spiked the price, tipped off the market, and alerted the French to exactly what Britain was doing. Instead, he used his brothers. Across the continent, in Paris and Frankfurt and Amsterdam, the Rothschild brothers began quietly buying gold and silver in small quantities. Small enough that no single purchase would move local prices. Small enough that nobody would notice a pattern. James in Paris was buying gold on French soil and moving it toward the very army fighting France. The metal was then smuggled. Couriers carried it. Boats ran it around the French coast. There is a delicious irony documented in the family's own correspondence. French officials, convinced that this drain of gold out of France would weaken Britain, actually helped the flow along, never grasping that the coin was destined for. Wellington's pay chest. Coin by coin, an entire fortune in bullion was fed across a hostile continent and into the war chest of the army fighting to destroy Napoleon. We are not guessing at the scale of this. The Rothschild Archive in London holds the actual account, a ledger, running daily, titled, An Account of Bullion and Specie furnished by Mr. N. M. Rothschild to J. C. Harries. It covers the period from the 4th of April to the 20th of October, 1815. And it records the exact total, 2,136,916 pounds, 11 shillings and 1 penny. Over 2 million pounds in gold, in 1815, shipped in secret around the French coast. And the ledger even tells us how it was packed. 884 boxes, 55 casks. Picture that. Nearly 900 sealed boxes of gold and silver, hauled onto boats, rowed through the surf, moving in the dark, past the guns of an empire, every single one a target, every single one insured against nothing but the family's own competence. Nathan himself, years later, is said to have described this commission with a single chilling phrase, the best business I ever did. Not the most profitable, necessarily the most important. Because it made the Rothschilds indispensable to the British state. Once you are the firm the treasury cannot fight a war without, you are no longer a foreign merchant on sufferance in the city. You are a pillar of the realm. And this is where the numbers stop being about one shipment and start becoming about an empire. Because the gold for Wellington was only one part of what Nathan handled. Britain was not just funding its own army. It was bankrolling the entire coalition against Napoleon, paying subsidies to its continental allies. The Prussians, the Austrians, the Russians, keeping their armies in the field so they would keep marching on Paris. This was the sinew of the whole 6th and 7th coalitions, and the Rothschild network became the pipe through which that money flowed. By 1815, Nathan's total transactions with Harries, the bullion for Wellington, plus the subsidies to Britain's allies, came to just under £9.8 million. Let me translate that into a figure you can feel. Roughly £910 million in today's money. Nearly £1 billion moved through the hands of one banking family in the service of one war. Some estimates of the total gold and funds the Rothschilds channeled to Wellington and the Allies run to over £11 million by 1815. This is the foundation, not a trick. A war economy, running through a courtyard off St. Swithin's Lane. And now, here is where the threads converge and where the myth was born. By the spring of 1815, Napoleon had escaped from his first exile on the small island of Elba, slipped ashore in the south of France, watched the soldiers sent to arrest him defect and cheer him instead, marched north to Paris without firing a shot, and plunged Europe back into war. History calls it the 100 Days. The whole thing would be decided in a matter of weeks, and for the Rothschilds, this was not just a military crisis. It was a financial one, and at first a dangerous one for them specifically, because their entire recent business model, the gold buying, the subsidies, the bullion smuggling, was built on the assumption of a long war. They had bought and were holding vast stockpiles of gold to service that war. If the war dragged on, they were positioned perfectly. The army would keep needing coin, and they would keep supplying it. But if the war ended suddenly, all that gold could lose its purpose and its premium overnight. A quick, decisive peace was, paradoxically, a threat to them. Nathan was sitting on a mountain of metal that a sudden peace could turn from an asset into a liability. Then came Waterloo, the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon, defeated by Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher, whose late afternoon arrival on the French right flank sealed the outcome. Final, total. And here is the part of the legend that is actually true. The Rothschilds did have an information advantage. Their private courier network, the fastest in Europe, running relays of riders and fast boats, brought early word of Wellington's victory to Nathan in London ahead of the official government dispatch. The tradition, plausible if not perfectly documented, is that a Rothschild agent obtained an early Dutch newspaper account and rushed it across the channel to New Court. Remember, Major Percy's official news did not arrive until the night of June 21st. The Rothschild couriers beat it perhaps by a day. This part is real. The information advantage was genuine. But now watch how far the reality diverges from the myth. The myth says Nathan used that early news to sell in a panic, crash the market, and buy at the bottom. What the historical record actually shows is the opposite. There is one contemporary hint of what he did, and it survives in a letter written to Nathan in late July 1815 by his agent, a man named John Roworth. In a postscript, almost an afterthought, Roworth writes, "I am informed by Commissary White you have done well by the early information which you had of the victory gained at Waterloo." That is it. That is the single surviving contemporary trace of Nathan profiting from the Waterloo news. No figure, no boast, no engineered crash, no panicked pillar on the exchange floor. Just a quiet line in a postscript buried in ordinary business correspondence. And the historian who has studied these records more closely than anyone, Niall Ferguson, in his authoritative 2-volume history, The House of Rothschild, built directly on the family archive, argues that whatever quick trading gain Nathan made from the early Waterloo news was modest, on the order of thousands of pounds, not millions, a useful edge, not a coup. And Ferguson points out something the myth-makers never grasped. In those chaotic days, Nathan may actually have been more worried than gleeful, because peace threatened his gold position. So, if the early news was not the fortune, where is the fortune? Here it is. And it is the real masterstroke, the thing the myth completely erased. After Waterloo, Nathan did not sell, he bought. He began buying British government bonds called consols, the perpetual annuities that were the bedrock of British public debt, and he bought them heavily. And as the price of those bonds began to rise in the returning peace, most traders would have taken their profit and walked away, content. Nathan did not. He kept buying, and then he held. He held those bonds against the mounting anxiety of the market. He held them against the direct, repeated, increasingly frantic pleas of his own brothers who were writing to him from the continent begging him to sell, to lock in the gains, to stop exposing the family to such enormous unhedged risk. Nathan refused. He was betting on a specific reading of the future, that the return of peace and stability to Europe, and the eventual restoration of British public finances would drive government debt far higher than the frightened market expected, and he was. Willing to sit on that bet, month after month, while his own family panicked at him across the channel. He held for roughly 2 years, through the anxious, deflationary aftermath of the war, when Britain was drowning in debt and no outcome was certain. And in late 1817, with the price of consols up by more than 40% from where he had bought, Nathan Rothschild finally began to sell into the peak he had wagered on. The profit from that single sustained bet, when Ferguson scales it against the size of the economy of the day into modern terms, has been estimated at around £600 million in today's money. 600 million, not from a whispered lie. From holding his nerve when everyone, including his own blood, told him to fold. That is the coup. not a trick played on a trading floor in an afternoon. A cold, patient, terrifyingly large bet on the shape of the piece held past the point where lesser men would have broken. And the contemporary press caught the direction of it even at the time. The London Courier, in its evening edition of the 20th of July, 1815, reported that Nathan had made great purchases of stock. Great purchases. Buying. Not selling. The contemporary record and the myth point in exactly opposite directions. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this is a topic where conspiracy theories flourish and where a story about a banker and a battle can curdle into something poisonous very quickly. So let me be absolutely explicit about where the documented record ends and where the mythology begins, because the two have been deliberately tangled together for nearly 2 centuries, and the crudest version of the myth was engineered as a weapon. That crude version, the one you may have absorbed without knowing where it came from, did not come from any historical source. It came from a pamphlet. In 1846, a French writer named Mathieu Georges Derneville, writing under the pen name Satan, published a 36-page attack titled, in translation, The Edifying and Curious History of Rothschild, the First, King of the Jews. It was prompted by a fatal railway disaster on a Rothschild-financed line, and it was, at its core, an anti-Semitic hit piece dressed up as popular history. It invented the whole cinematic scene, that Nathan was personally present near the field of Waterloo, that he watched Napoleon's defeat with his own eyes, that he galloped to the coast and raced back across the channel through a storm, and that he used the advance news to steal a fortune through public deception. None of it was true. Nathan was not at Waterloo, he was not in Belgium, he was in London and Kent running his business. But the pamphlet sold over 60,000 copies across some 20 editions in a single year, spawning imitators and rebuttals that only spread it further. The lie went viral a full century before the internet existed to carry it. And then it got laundered into respectability. Later writers repeated it, each one lending it a little more credibility. A book by John Reeves in 1887 pushed the grandiose financial rulers of nations framing. Frederick Morton's popular 1962 family portrait, The Rothschilds, carried the scene to a mass paperback audience. A 1934 Hollywood film, The House of Rothschild, dramatized the legend for cinemagoers, and grotesquely clips from it were later cut into Nazi propaganda. And, most damningly for the record, even the Encyclopedia Britannica, the celebrated 11th edition, from 1910 to 1911, printed that Nathan is said to have been present at the Battle of Waterloo, and leaned on that claim to explain an immense profit. When a lie reaches the pages of the Britannica, it stops looking like a lie and starts looking like a fact. So let me separate it cleanly one last time. The documented facts: Nathan was not at the battle. His couriers did get early news, a real edge, but the quick gain from it was modest, thousands, not millions, and the sudden peace actually threatened a firm holding vast gold on a long war bet. The real fortune came from the opposite of a crash and grab, sustained buying and patient holding of consoles over roughly 2 years. And the genuine foundation underneath all of it was the years-long, high-risk, unglamorous work of financing a war, the smuggled gold in 884 boxes, the Allied subsidies, the sovereign debt strategy. One more caution. While we are cleaning house, you have probably heard the phrase, "buy when there's blood in the streets," attributed to a Baron Rothschild. Do not trust it either. Researchers have traced its earliest printed version only to an 1893 Toronto newspaper, with no convincing link to any actual member of the family. It is folklore, not evidence. And this matters because the villain in this story is never a people. The villain is a logic, the logic of information asymmetry and sovereign debt speculation. Keep your eye on the machine, not the men. So what is the real lesson here, the one worth carrying out of this video? It is this. The men with the muskets did not decide the age of Napoleon by themselves. The men with the money decided it with them. Wellington could not have fought without the gold that Nathan Rothschild smuggled to him in 884 boxes past the guns of France. The coalition could not have held together without the £9.8 million in bullion and subsidies that flowed through Newcourt to keep the Prussians and Austrians and Russians in the field. The battle was won on a field in Belgium, yes, but it was paid for in the ledgers of London, and the peace that followed was not simply inherited by the powerful. It was bet on deliberately by a man cold enough to buy when the world was afraid and patient enough to wait 2 years for the world to come around to his view. The real edge was never a single stolen secret whispered on a trading floor. The real edge was structural, a family that could see across borders when everyone else could only see across the street. And that understood government debt as the truest measure of who would win the war and who would pay for it. And here is the unsettling part, the part that bridges 2 centuries and lands squarely in your world. That machine never switched off. The idea that whoever holds the best information, the deepest pockets, and the steadiest nerve can turn a national catastrophe into private profit, that is not a relic of 1815. That is the operating system of modern finance. Every time a market lurches on news the public does not yet have, every time patient capital calmly buys the panic that ordinary people are selling, every time the debt of nations becomes the instrument through which fortunes are made and unmade, you are watching, in a direct line of descent, the logic of the Waterloo bet. Nathan Rothschild did not buy the Bank of England in a single day. The truth is stranger and larger. He helped build the world in which such a thing became imaginable, a world where money moves faster than armies and often knows the outcome first, and we are every single one of us still living inside that world. So here's what I want to know from you. If you had been standing on the floor of that exchange in the summer of 1815 with your own brothers riding across the channel to beg you to sell, with the whole market screaming at you to take the safe profit and go home, would you have had the nerve to hold for 2 more years? Drop a single gold coin emoji in the comments if you think you'd have held, and tell me why. I read them all. And if this is the kind of deep dive you come here for, the real history underneath the myth, subscribe to the channel. It genuinely makes a bigger difference than you'd think, and it keeps this kind of work coming. I'll see you in the next one.